my first video was a bit of an unscripted mess meant to test the waters, I'm happy to say it seems like you folks are interested. Bringing the Age of the Gilded Iron Horse to life is a passion of mine in the highest degree, so I'm happy to provide. Anyway, without further ado, welcome to Model Railroading with Iron Pony. This is how I turned a Bachmann New Tooled 440 into a proper Baldwin 8-26C for my fictional railroad, the Niobrara Northern. The best place to start for the planning of this project was my inspiration. Before there was the Niobrara Northern, there was the Clear Creek and Big Rock Candy Mountain, my railroad in the tumultuously regarded railroads online. I cheesed the game for hours to procure my first newly purchased locomotive, a Eureka 440, which I decided to name Esceryna, after, well, it's a long story, much longer than I want this video to be. Like any person who met a single short-term goal in railroads online, I quit the game immediately after and put my fictional Baldwin in the back of my head to pursue proper prototype modeling. It was only recently that I decided to put some serious thought into the backstory of my developing layout. It wasn't quite based on any real town and was constructed to ambiguously serve as an overnight boomtown of the late 19th century or a lost-to-time rural community that could plausibly exist up until perhaps the 70s. The story of the town and railroad would develop until I decided it would be a town along a creek that fed into the Niobrara River in Nebraska in 1878. As a quick introductory blurb, the Niobrara Northern was started as a subsidiary of the Union Pacific with the purpose of linking the UP with the developing Northern Pacific, but was sold in the panic of 1873 so the Union Pacific could focus on operating their existing trackage. The Niobrara Northern, now independent, would chip away at the initial plan to meet the Northern Pacific with least power until the first of their purpose-ordered locomotives arrived. One such engine was Esceryna, a Baldwin 826C built in the first months of 1875. I had whittled it down to the point that Esceryna was effectively a Virginia and Truckee 440, but what did that mean for the project at large? First, we must discuss the prototype of the Bachmann 440, or rather, the lack thereof. Bachmann's spunky 440 best represents absolutely nothing. It's a Baldwin for sure, but it curiously has a slew of features and a lack of others that prevent it from accurately representing any prototype. It has the headlight bracket of a pre-1875 Baldwin, so it should represent either Genoa or Reno, but that's only in theory. According to what I could find, one of the first modifications performed to all of the Virginia and Truckee 440s was the addition of a Westinghouse air pump. So it represents them as built? Of course not. The Bachmann engines present with feedwater injectors on both sides of the locomotive, and none of the Virginia and Truckee 440s would have received even one until about the 1880s, when each one already had air pumps. So perhaps it's not a Virginia and Truckee 440 at all. I doubt it. By the time crosshead pumps had been phased out, particularly on both sides of the locomotive, practically any engine worth its salt would have had an air pump. So what did I have to do to make Esceryna the way I wanted her? Firstly, I specifically chose 1875 as her build year because this was the first year Baldwin began using the lake color as seen on the Eureka and Palisade Eureka, and I'm quite fond of it. I also decided she'd have a supplementary injector, as none at the time of construction would have been powerful enough to keep up with the demands of an engine under operation. I also decided she'd have a Radley Hunter balloon stack and a horizontal staved pilot. So effectively, Eureka but standard gauge. The last major modification I chose to add was a Westinghouse air brake setup, which would have been added by the railroad, as that gave me an excuse to mount it wherever I wanted. Finally, she'd have a headlight painting made by my partner based off a little something I whipped up in my sketchbook. The first step was correcting some of Bachmann's minor mistakes to prime the base model for modifications. This included chiseling off the molded injector lines, applying a custom designed and 3D printed reverser rod on the engineer's side, reshaping the running boards to their proper fin profile, and lobbing off some of the details that weren't fit for the engine I was attempting to depict. Once I had the base figured out, I started accumulating appropriate detail parts to represent the aforementioned, more or less as-built plus pump engine. This included a 6-inch Westinghouse pump, a single injector and check valve, an 1875 onward headlight and bracket, better-looking handrail stanchions, a Hunter Radley stack, a proper Baldwin smoke box front, a horizontal stave pilot, and crosshead pumps, plus a handful of other custom-designed and small detail parts, including a pretty kick-ass number plate that was way more difficult to make than it needed to be. Thanks, SketchUp. I decided to take a road less traveled by and add rivets to the boiler jacket. Microscale rivet decals were a bit too proud for the superfine rivets on the boiler, so I passed on them in favor of a good old trumpeter riveting tool. The first of many major errors in this project was when I mounted the original pilot too far back. This severely limited the range of motion in the pony truck, so I decided to go back to the drawing board. I actually went ahead and got a different pilot, which I was pleasantly surprised to find out was actually a Baldwin pilot. Most of the other odds and ends went on in a fairly straightforward fashion. One thing that gave me a lot of trouble was the headlight bracket. It had to be bent to shape, which sure is a lot easier said than done. I went through a few methods of trying to jury-rig it to the rest of the model until I finally landed on one of the stupidest things I could possibly think of. Insert the big flashing whatever here that says what I did. And it worked. Sort of. Well, it wasn't cockeyed on the original shell. Emphasis on that. I was a bit undereducated when it came to apply the outclad black gloss I intended to use to give depth to the Vallejo metal colors I was going to use. It ended up a bit chunky, so I decided to strip it. What followed was a series of poorly thought out events that led to the destruction of the shell. I first tried isopropyl alcohol, but it wasn't even making a dent in the rock-solid outclad. I had attempted to remove the valve linkages and crosshead guides with acetone as someone at Bachmann had decided to make my day worse by gluing them in. Although it didn't work, the piston survived the acetone just fine. I know, famous last words. I ended up pouring acetone over the shell under the assumption it was made of the same plastic, and it almost instantaneously shriveled up into something akin to that one corpse from Half-Life 2. Although I was feeling defeated, I took a deep breath, ordered a new shell, and waited for it to arrive. This time, with some advice of a mutual on Instagram, I opted to strip the factory paint beforehand with isopropyl. This gave me a much smoother model than I would have got from the original shell anyway. I kept things moving in other areas while I waited, and I broke the aforementioned valve linkages and crosshead guides. But not to worry, I had a backup plan. I had a Junker 440 that I'm not even going to bother describing it, actually. They just disintegrated the second I pulled them out of the cylinders. So it was back to the parts store. And they sent me 2 right-handed valve rods. Though the Rothschilds were clearly telling Bachmann to make this project as difficult as possible for me, I trudged onwards. I decided to just clip the rod, mount the clip pieces in the sockets, and styrene cement them back together the right way around. The air pump was probably the greatest challenge of this project. It included all sorts of spindly wires that had to mount in very precise locations to be considered prototypical. I widened the holes on the outlets and soldered brass wires and shaped them once they were mounted. The process for the injector was more or less the same song and dance. If I could go back and change one step of the detail phase, it would have been to include a proper Baldwin sand dome. I was able to 3D print an extension to the steam dome that looked pretty convincing, but I tolerated the sand dome at the time. I'm not as excited about it now, but it doesn't look half bad detailed and painted. For the stack, the Shapeways Hunter Radley stack was a press fit once you, clip the unnecessary retaining collar protruding from the member, I mean boiler. Cylinder drain cocks are always a must to me. The original set I designed was a bit too chunky, but I ended up making a more subtle pair later on. Mounting the pilot was one of the more frustrating parts of the build. It was by no fault of the designer, but rather my clapped out JB Weld 5-minute epoxy that decided to become JB Stick Together a Little Bit 47-minute epoxy. To my utter bewilderment, my CA glue came through and decided that maybe I'm not so bad after all. Though finicky on the original shell, the handrail stanchions fit in a lot easier the second time around. The longer variation of the precision scale parts are pretty much a drop-in replacement for the Bachmann ones. No drilling into the boiler or cab required. The smoke box was a piece of cake. Just remove the old one and stick the new one on with some CA glue. Then find a number plate to your liking. I couldn't, so as mentioned earlier, I made one in SketchUp. That more or less wraps up the detailing stage. Now to focus on painting. Since we're still on the topic of the number plate, I'll start with that. I just painted it gold and then used some thin down paint to creep into the recesses. I think it turned out pretty good. A huge part of making these models is that you have to keep in mind that painting the frames was all the rage at the time. Hand painting usually suffices, so take an extra half hour to capture that detail. It makes a huge difference. But remember to paint the firebox first though. Speaking of fireboxes, I like to depict the bare metal on my engines with Vallejo's amazing metal color line. I use burnt iron for the firebox and smokebox. And though a very similar color on the surface, the steel has a blue undertone that I think suits the Russia iron boiler jacket fairly well. If this is still too light for you, you can go over it with Tamiya clear smoke. Though it would probably be a nice touch, I leave my jackets plain. The motion, rods, and unpainted areas of the frame are gone over with burnt iron. It's not the most accurate color, but I did this to match the stock Bachmann rods. I prefer to avoid painting anything that needs lubrication if possible. The cab, tender floor, and running boards use one of my favorite effects to achieve realistic wood grain. I apply diluted oil paint, a few shades darker than the base, and drag it in one direction as it dries. Anything that you see that is light colored is Formula P3 Umbral Umber. It wasn't quite the color I was expecting, but it really came to life after receiving gloss. Most lining on the model was done by hand, clearly. The decals on this model were a chore. I used my usual methods of printing them on white decal stock with my inkjet printer. Though I sealed them in the same manner as my Jupiter, there was a lot of chipping and bleeding. I'm still not entirely sure what went wrong. It patched up the dodgy areas with the Umbral Umber. Under most lighting conditions, you can't really tell. The headlight was going to be the thing that made or broke the model. My partner went through a lot of trouble to make the painting that can be seen on it. While the sides came out fine, I'm not particularly happy with the top. I might take the old decals off and hand paint the lining like I did on my Jupiter somewhere down the road. After all the painted details were picked out, I sealed it with some aqua gloss, put on my usual wood load, applied a bell cord, and got to running the model. Speaking of which, let's check that out. Overall, I'm decently happy with how everything came out. More so than the Jupiter, I think this model is more than the sum of its parts, because the parts don't exactly amount to much on their own. There is a lot I wish I'd done differently with this model, but as I said, it adds up to something pretty decent.